Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are attempting to contain a man who really consciously refused to be contained.
Oh, absolutely. A figure who somehow manages to bridge the gap between, this passionate romanticism and the icy precision of literary realism.
We are diving into the multiple identities, the brilliant works, and the frankly bizarre psychological legacy of Marie-Henri Beyle, who everyone knows as Stendhal.
And our mission today is to take this entire stack of sources, his life, his theoretical writings, his really controversial reception, and turn them into cohesive knowledge for you.
Because Stendhal isn't just a writer, he's more like an intellectual riddle.
He is. He's the author critics credit with inventing modern, serious realism. Yet, if you ask most people, he's best known for a strange physical malady named after him.
And that abstract, almost systematic analysis of how we fall in love, it's a very strange combination.
It is, to be the starting point of one of the most intellectually rigorous movements in literature, while also being the namesake for, a psychological reaction to art.
Exactly. Stendhal spent his entire life trying to live this flamboyant romantic existence, hiding behind a whole series of honestly hilarious aliases. And yet his greatest contribution to the world was his absolutely merciless, almost clinical psychological clarity. We're dealing with duality at every single level here.
We are. And we want to understand why a writer who dedicated his work to the happy few, and let's be honest, struggled for recognition in his own time, is now considered just indispensable.
So we'll start by unpacking the man himself. Marie-Henri Beyle, born in Grenoble in 1783, died in Paris 1842.
We'll trace his path from Napoleon's army to the salons of Paris, analyze his most enduring nonfiction ideas, crystallization and Stendhal syndrome.
And finally, we'll grapple with his literary style, examining why his novels, especially The Red and the Black and The Charterhouse of Parma, are seen as these foundational texts of modernity.
So let's begin. The origins of the man who saw life as a masked ball.
Okay, let's unpack this complicated, intensely self-analyzing man. And we have to start with the deep wound of his childhood.
We do.
The sources all describe Marie-Henri Beyle's early life as definingly unhappy, which seems so contrary to the passionate, theatrical characters he would later create.
Right. And the central tragedy, really the thing that shapes everything, is the death of his mother, Henriette Gagnon. She died in childbirth when he was only 7.
And that loss, which he felt so intensely, seems to have just permanently skewed his emotional life.
It wasn't just the loss, though. It was the environment that came after. His father, Cherubin Beyle, was an advocate, a landowner, firmly bourgeois.
And Stendhal carried a lifelong antipathy toward him. He famously called his father unimaginative.
Which, for an intellect as restless and romantic as Beyle's, was probably the worst insult you could possibly level at someone.
Exactly. That early sense of psychological isolation, that rebellion against the stifling order of the French provincial bourgeoisie, that really becomes the engine for his fiction.
It does. He's rebelling against the mundane, the regulated, the predictable, which is exactly what his protagonists, like Julien Sorel in The Red and the Black, are doing constantly.
But he did have one steady emotional anchor, right? His younger sister, Pauline.
Yes, Pauline. He maintained a steady, very detailed correspondence with her throughout his life. That connection is absolutely vital.
And you can sort of see his later focus on female characters, who are often so much more active and intellectually complex than the men.
You can see it stemming from that foundational connection. I mean, they aren't just plot devices for him. They are intensely observed, fully realized human beings.
And this internal tension he had, his bourgeois background versus the radical emotional life he craved, that also shaped his politics, right?
Yeah.
This ambiguous attitude toward Napoleon and the monarchy.
Completely. He had one foot planted in the establishment through his family, but his head and his heart were already drifting toward these revolutionary liberal ideals.
And that tension became very, very real when he encountered the French Empire. The military and theatrical worlds of Napoleon's France were, as our sources say, a total revelation for him.
Absolutely. The army gave him a stage for the ambition and the intellectual energy that provincial Grenoble could never, ever satisfy.
He served as an assistant war commissioner, an auditor with the Conseil d'État.
But it was his participation in the military campaigns that really forged the analytical, disciplined mind that would later be capable of writing realism.
And we have to pause here, because his time during the disastrous 1812 invasion of Russia provides the ultimate anecdote, illustrating his famous sang-froid, that cool-headed self-possession.
This is where we start building the case for Stendhal as the originator of realism. He witnessed the burning of Moscow.
An event of almost apocalyptic romantic scale.
Right. But the profound insight into his character comes during the winter retreat that followed, which was one of the most catastrophic military failures in history. Starvation, disease, freezing chaos everywhere.
And the sources emphasize that he remarkably maintained his daily routine, including shaving every single day.
Shaving. Amidst total human breakdown, he clung to that tiny, disciplined, almost absurd act of civilization.
So if I'm following you, you're arguing this isn't just some quirky detail. This is the core of his literary methodology, isn't it?
Precisely. The ability to observe and impose order on overwhelming chaos. Literary realists didn't just report on events, they selected details that spoke volumes about human character.
And his insistence on shaving suggests this iron will, this dedication to mental clarity, to maintaining a sense of self above the environmental pressures.
That clinical distance from personal disaster is the exact same distance he later applied to his character's emotional disasters.
And it wasn't just a psychological posture. His clear-headedness proved pragmatically useful. He saved his own life and the lives of others.
He did, during the crossing of the Berezina River. He was the commissioner of war supplies, so he could see the logistical nightmare unfolding. The main pontoon bridge was overwhelmed. Thousands were dying.
And Stendhal, keeping his head, identified a usable ford across the river and led his companions to safety.
He used practical, on-the-ground observation, the hallmark of a realist, to survive the romantic tragedy of the campaign.
So he returns to Paris, a competent survivor, his admiration for Napoleon still intact. He saw the emperor as the ultimate self-made man.
But then, the fall of Napoleon in 1814 meant the end of that theatrical world he loved, so he made a defining choice.
He left France for Italy.
And this was the period he considered the happiest of his entire life.
Yeah.
He settled in Milan, stayed until 1821, and only left because his anti-Austrian sentiments and his fear of getting involved with the Carbonari.
The revolutionary secret societies.
Exactly. It just made his position too precarious.
His attachment to Italy was profound. He saw it as a place of genuine, unvarnished human emotion. More sincere, more passionate than the stiff, politically reactionary atmosphere of Restoration France.
He romanticized Italy as the home of truth, and he used that difference in emotional temperament as a literary tool.
Right, there's that famous, slightly tongue-in-cheek aside he puts into the Charterhouse of Parma.
A novel he wrote in a feverish 52 days, which is incredible.
He describes a character driven to contemplate suicide out of despair over love. And he feels he has to explain this intense reaction to his French readers.
Yes, he says, and I'm paraphrasing here. To make this clear to my French readers, I must explain that in Italy, a country very far from us, people are still driven to despair by love.
The idea that he had to clarify the mere possibility of dying from heartbreak to a Parisian audience says everything.
It does. It highlights his belief that true, unadulterated passion had been suffocated by French society, while Italy still offered an environment where emotions were visceral, even destructive.
And this emotional sensibility linked directly to his political identity. He was an avowed, liberal, anti-clerical.
Highly critical of the Bourbon Restoration. His time in Italy convinced him that Romanticism, with its focus on intense emotional life and freedom, was the perfect aesthetic counterpart to political liberalism.
He saw the fight for political freedom mirrored in the fight for artistic freedom, and his politics had very real consequences for his career.
They did. You mentioned he was appointed French consul in Trieste in 1830.
And was promptly rejected.
Yes. Prince Metternich, the powerful Austrian foreign minister, the symbol of European conservatism, refused to grant him the exequatur, the official recognition. Explicitly because of Stendhal's known liberalism and his outspoken anti-clerical views. This was not a man who kept his opinions to himself. He was publicly identified with the movement that threatened the established order.
So we have this precise, cool-headed veteran who is at the same time a passionate, politically engaged liberal. Let's turn now to his famously complex romantic life. The dandy, the obsessive womanizer, and the secret feminist.
He was a man consumed by the chase and by the analysis of the chase. His nonfiction treatise, De l'Amour, which we'll explore in detail, was basically an attempt to rationalize his own unrequited passion for Mathilde, Countess Dembowska.
And he suffered profoundly from what he called the restlessness in spirit his pursuits caused, yet he just had to categorize that suffering intellectually.
And it wasn't just the sophisticated European women. The sources mention his deep distress when his childhood friend, Victorine, married. He described her to his sister Pauline as the woman of his dreams.
Just shows the depth of the sentimental life he was trying to cage with rational analysis.
His personal life was often messy, but his intellectual observations about women were revolutionary for the time. This is why figures like Simone de Beauvoir later spoke so highly of his empathy.
In the second sex, right?
Exactly. She gave him significant credit, arguing that he genuinely perceived a woman as simply a human being, rather than a collection of social roles or a function of male desire.
That's a powerful distinction. He saw the individual humanity first. De Beauvoir even called him a feminist writer, primarily citing his rebellious heroines.
Characters like Mathilde de la Mole in The Red and the Black, who actively carve out their own destinies and refuse to be defined by patriarchal expectations.
But Beauvoir, ever the sharp critic, she offered a nuanced view.
She did. She noted that while he championed women's freedom and equality of spirit, his ultimate vision for them was still, generally, limited to marriage.
So it shows the limits of his era, and maybe the limits of his own imagination regarding social structure. His radicalism was psychological, not fully structural.
I think that's a perfect way to put it.
It's a fantastic insight. Now, before we move to his formal concepts, we have to acknowledge the immense physical toll his life took. The sources detail his protracted health struggles, starting with syphilis, contracted in 1808.
This is a truly painful chapter, and it must have fueled his need for self-analysis. The treatments he received were, by modern standards, horrific.
19th century methods. He was taking iodide of potassium and, crucially, quicksilver mercury to combat the disease.
And he was the clinical observer, even of his own suffering. He meticulously documented the consequences in his journals.
Swollen armpits, difficulty swallowing, agonizing pains in his testicles, chronic sleeplessness.
And profound neurological symptoms. Giddiness, roaring in the ears, a racing pulse, and tremors so severe he admitted he could scarcely hold a fork or a pen.
And modern historians of medicine believe that many of those symptoms, the tremors and vertigo, were more likely for mercury poisoning than the disease itself.
He was being constantly, systematically poisoned by his doctors while traveling across Europe, desperately seeking cures. This constant physical agony must have contributed to his need for intellectual control and escape.
Which brings us to the ultimate form of escape and control, the pseudonym. The man who defined realism was obsessed with hiding his true identity. He used over 100 aliases.
This wasn't just a literary quirk, it was a psychological compulsion, a way to live multiple lives at once. The sources list names from the formal, like Dominique or Salviati, to the completely absurd.
Louis-Alexandre Bombette, Don Flem, William Crocodile.
William Crocodile. It speaks to the theatrical quality of his mind.
And the name we know him by, Stendhal, was borrowed from the German city of Stendhal, the birthplace of the art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann.
And he added the H, just to make sure the Germanic pronunciation was clear. He was that precise.
He viewed life itself as a grand, complicated game. He advised himself in his private writings, look upon life as a masked ball.
It was a deliberate strategy to achieve Beylism, the term later coined for that intense, self-proclaimed egotism and self-analysis you see in his characters.
The irony is so rich, isn't it? The man who wanted to be a lanky blonde German, who hid behind countless masks, who advocated for the subjective pleasure of living anonymously,
is celebrated precisely for his capacity for unflinching, objective realism. His deepest personal truth was found in the fictional disguise. That tension defines his genius.
That is the perfect hinge point. The man is defined by his masks, but his legacy is defined by his clarity. Let's move from the personal identity to the intellectual framework he created or inspired.
Okay.
So now we transition from the biography of the masked man to the psychological concepts he formalized, starting with his own rational analysis of love, crystallization.
Yes, from Delamour, published in 1822. It's Stendhal's attempt to reduce romantic passion, the very thing that caused him so much personal pain, to a systematic, almost scientific process.
It's a phenomenal attempt at intellectual containment.
It is. Stendhal argues that falling in love is a mental process of idealization, where the mind attributes imaginary perfection to the object of affection, and he uses a famous analogy to explain this.
The journey from Bologna to Rome. I find this analogy incredibly helpful because it grounds the abstract.
It does. Bologna, in this framework, represents indifference. It's the pre-romantic state where you're just observing the person and your imagination is dormant.
And Rome, by contrast, is the destination. Perfect love, where the object is entirely idealized in your mind.
And the key is that the departure from Bologna, that initial spark, the shift from indifference to fixation, is instinctive. It's not willed. Once your mind fixes on the person, the process of crystallization begins.
And he compares this process to what happens to a tree branch left in a salt mine.
Exactly. Over time, the branch becomes coated with sparkling, beautiful crystals. The bare branch is the person's true self. The crystals are all the imagined perfections we project onto them.
And he breaks this down into 4 defined stages, a roadmap of how we fool ourselves into passion. Let's walk through the journey.
Okay, stage 1 is admiration. This is the initial perception of qualities. You see something about the person, a talent, a physical attribute, a witty remark that is pleasant and impressive. It's simple, objective observation.
Stage 2 is acknowledgement. The process becomes reciprocal, or at least you start to think it could be.
Right. This is the recognition that it would be pleasant, even beneficial, to gain the loved one's interest. The potential for interaction shifts the dynamic from passive admiration to active personal interest.
Then comes stage 3, hope. This is where the imagination really takes over.
It takes flight. Hope envisions gaining the person's love, dreaming of a future shared with them. The possibilities begin to overshadow the observed realities. You start weaving stories.
And finally, stage 4, delight. And Stendhal is really specific here.
He is. This is the delight derived from overrating the beauty and merit of the person whose love one hopes to win. This is the full crystallization moment. The mind has finished coating the bare branch with imaginary diamonds. The person is now flawless, magnificent, perfect in your subjective view.
It's fascinating, isn't it? For a writer credited with realism, his major psychological theory is all about the necessary function of illusion in love.
You could argue that crystallization is the first modern systematic theory of cognitive bias in romantic attraction. It explains why 6 months later, when the crystals start to dissolve, the person you loved seems so utterly different from the person standing in front of you.
Because you were in love with your own creation.
Exactly.
That intellectual leap from suffering intense heartbreak to rationally charting the steps of that suffering is peak Baylism. And the origin story of this whole concept is pure Stendhalian theater.
Oh, it's the ultimate synthesis of the mundane and the profound. He was talking to a Madame Girardi during a trip to the Salzburg salt mine. While describing the geological process of salt crystal formation, the analogy just struck him. He immediately detailed the entire process. Bologna, Rome, the 4 stacks on the back of a playing card.
On the back of a playing card, it's the perfect snapshot of the man. Intellectual genius applied casually, obsessively, and recorded fleetingly.
It is. Now, if crystallization is about the internal, analytical construction of love, we have to shift to the concept named after him, which is all about the external, overwhelming, and profoundly physical reaction to art.
Stendhal syndrome. This shift is a beautiful contrast. We go from the mind idealizing a person to the body collapsing under the weight of cultural perfection.
Precisely. The Stendhal syndrome is named for an experience he had in Florence in 1817, which he later documented in Naples and Florence, a journey from Milan to Reggio.
What exactly happened when he was confronted with the concentration of history there?
He was utterly overcome. The specific location was the Basilica of Santa Croce, which is just a treasure trove of art and history. It's got the tombs of Michelangelo, Galileo, Machiavelli.
So cultural density overload.
Exactly. And upon leaving the porch of that basilica, he was hit by this profound psychosomatic reaction.
How did he describe the feeling? I mean, the physical feeling.
He documented a fierce palpitation of the heart, an unnerving sense that the wellspring of life was dried up within me. This was coupled with severe dizziness, giddiness, and a constant fear of falling to the ground.
So a panic attack. Induced by sheer cultural overload, the density of genius and history compacted into one space.
It sounds like it. It's almost the physical opposite of the cool clinical self-control he maintained while shaving during the Russian campaign.
Right. It suggests that while he could impose order on chaos, he struggled to contain the intense beauty of human accomplishment.
That tension is key. He could rationalize love, but he couldn't rationalize cultural awe. His experience remained an interesting anecdote for over a century until it was formally recognized.
By the Italian psychiatrist Graziella Magherini.
Yes, in 1979. The condition, a specific set of symptoms including a racing heart, nausea, dizziness, fainting, primarily affecting sensitive first-time visitors to cities like Florence, was diagnosed and officially named Stendhal syndrome.
So we have 2 remarkable psychological legacies attached to his name. Crystallization, the internal rational method for dissecting the illusion of love detailed on a playing card.
And Stendhal syndrome, The external, involuntary physical surrender to the reality of overwhelming beauty, documented on the steps of Santa Croce.
It perfectly captures the split nature of the man, the analytical scientist trying to contain the romantic soul.
He was perpetually trying to be both Bologna and Rome at the same time, maintaining indifference while experiencing perfect rapture.
That sets the stage beautifully for his ultimate contribution, the literature that synthesized these two forces.
Yes, let's get into the novels.
Moving now to his literary identity. And it's important to remember that Stendhal was not a blockbuster seller in his time. He famously dedicated his work to the happy few, a phrase he wrote in English in the original text.
And this is often misinterpreted as pure literary elitism.
But it's not, is it?
No, the irony is crucial. Our sources confirm this phrase is almost certainly an ironic reference to Oliver Goldsmith's 1766 novel, The Vicar of Wakefield.
Okay, unpack that for us.
In that book, the phrase ironically refers to the tiny number of people who actually read the title, character's obscure, pedantic treatise on monogamy.
So Stendhal wasn't necessarily being arrogant. He was being commercially realistic, maybe even self-deprecating.
Exactly. He knew his precise, highly analytical style was not going to appeal to the mass audience of the high romantic era, who preferred the epic drama of writers like Victor Hugo. His genius would have to wait.
He had a very clear sense of his own aesthetic position, though, the romantic realist.
He did. He championed the romantic aesthetic in works like Racine and Shakespeare, arguing for freedom in form, praising Shakespeare's boundless scope and complexity, while unfavorably comparing him to Racine's strict classical rules.
He wanted the passionate subject matter of romanticism, but with the disciplined observation of a scientist.
That drive for discipline and precision led to the methodology that defines his lasting contribution. His novel, The Red and the Black, is considered his most notable work, a clear literary tribute to the world of ambition and political flux created by Napoleon.
And this is where we need to unpack the theory. Literary theorist Cornelie Kvass discusses Stendhal's profound metaphor for the novel.
The novel as a mirror being carried in a basket. This is the foundational idea of Stendhalian realism.
Okay, let's break this down. What does the mirror in a basket tell us about his realism compared to just saying the novel reflects reality?
It tells us two crucial things. First, the mirror reflects reality. That is the objective requirement of realism.
Sure.
But the second part, the basket, acknowledges the inherent subjectivity of the author. The writer is carrying the mirror, selecting when and where to pull it out and show the world what is happening. The artist's goal is not just documentation, it is selection, organization, and judgment.
So it's edited reality. The author selects and organizes reality for a cognitive function, aiming for unity, coherence, and most importantly, typicality.
Exactly. Stendhal's realism is about cognitive function, meaning the arrangement of facts is designed to make you, the reader, understand the psychology and the social forces at play.
Which takes us directly to the assessment of Erich Auerbach, who argued that modern serious realism began with Stendhal and Balzac.
Yes.
We need to understand what Auerbach meant by serious realism. What differentiated Stendhal's approach from earlier novelists?
Auerbach's key point in his seminal work, Mimesis, is that Stendhal integrated the volatile, specific historical moment into the very substance of his characters' lives and actions in a way that had never been done before. Earlier realism often focused on social manners or generalized class issues. Stendhal focused on contingency.
Give us a concrete example of this historical contingency in The Red and the Black.
Auerbach points out that scenes in the novel are almost incomprehensible without a detailed knowledge of the political, social, and economic stratification of that perfectly definite historical moment just before the July Revolution of 1830.
So Julian Sorel's entire dilemma, the conflict between ambition in the army, the red, and safety in the clergy, the black, is a situation dictated entirely by the reactionary political environment of the Restoration period.
It is. The pressure of history isn't just a backdrop, it's an active force shaping the individual's choices and ultimately their downfall. Stendhal was writing timeless psychological truth through meticulously contemporary political observation.
He was using the novel as a serious vehicle for investigating the individual human being trapped within the rigid structures of a specific, volatile historical environment.
And he applied that same observational rigor to nonfiction. He wrote A Life of Napoleon, A Life of Rossini.
And that Rossini biography is valued more today for its wide-ranging musical criticism than for its strict historical accuracy.
Right. It reflects his deep love of composers like Haydn, Mozart, and Rossini. Even his posthumously published autobiographies, Memoirs of an Egotist and The Life of Henry Brulard, carry this historical weight.
Auerbach noted that Stendhal's self-analysis is far more closely and concretely connected with the politics, sociology, and economics of the period than similar autobiographies by Rousseau or Goethe.
He was a product of history in a way that seemed to affect him more directly than anyone else.
This makes the critical appraisal of his work so fascinating because it creates this massive divide between those who loved his insight and those who loathed his style.
Oh, a huge divide.
Let's start with the psychological champions.
They are effusive. Hippolyte Taine, a major French critic, argued that Stendhal's psychological portraits were real because they are complex, like living human beings. He saw the complexity of the internal struggle made manifest.
And maybe the greatest endorsement came from Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yes, in Beyond Good and Evil, he called Stendhal France's last great psychologist. Nietzsche valued him so highly he described encountering his work as one of the most beautiful accidents of his life, ranking the discovery nearly as high as Dostoevsky.
That comparison to Dostoevsky is significant. For Nietzsche to put Stendhal in that company, despite his often cool, concise style, shows the power of his internal observations.
Émile Zola, too, praised his psychological accuracy, though he also noted the structural implausibilities and Stendhal's very visible authorial intervention.
The mirror in the basket principle.
Basically, yes.
But then we have the doubters, most notably Vladimir Nabokov, who was famously dismissive of what he saw as a clumsy, unpolished style.
Nabokov was cutting, as always. He dismissed Stendhal as that pet of all those who like their French plain, asserting that the red and the black is much overrated and criticizing his paltry style.
This highlights a fundamental schism in literary history. If a writer's prose is occasionally abrupt or lacks aesthetic beauty, does that diminish the profundity of their psychological insight?
That's the argument, that his analysis is brilliant, but the vehicle is sometimes flawed. The insight overcomes the style. And this tension is what Erich Auerbach ultimately synthesized in his final appraisal.
Okay, so how did Auerbach reconcile this?
He gave what might be the most balanced yet most powerful critique. He admitted Stendhal was not quite a great figure, his ideas were erratic, and his style short-winded. He even said the prose only seldom wholly takes possession of and fixes the subject. It's an evaluation full of serious caveats.
But despite these flaws, Auerbach deemed him historically indispensable. Why?
Because Stendhal was compelled by his specific circumstances. His personal instability, his desire to escape the old order, his position in the tumultuous aftermath of Napoleon, to look at reality in a fundamentally new way.
So his own psychology matched the needs of his chaotic historical moment.
Exactly. His fluctuation between romantic rapture and cold, bayless self-control meant he was the right person with the right tools at the right moment in history to come to terms with reality in a way which no one had done before him. He invented the means for the modern novel to become a serious tool for political and psychological investigation.
An incredible legacy, inventing realism almost by accident.
In a way, yes.
So what a profound and contradictory figure. We started with Marie-Henri Beyle, the unhappy bourgeois child who found a theatrical stage in Napoleon's military machine.
Displaying almost inhuman sang-froid while literally shaving during the catastrophic retreat from Moscow, he cherished Italy as the only place where despair was a viable reaction to love.
He was a dandy and the egotist, yet recognized by Simone de Beauvoir as a proto-feminist for his perceptive insight into women's humanity.
He was a man suffering from terrible medical treatments, whose identity was so fractured he required over 100 aliases, forever trying to perfect the art of the mask.
And his name defines the emotional and cultural landscape. He gave us crystallization, the four-step rational process detailed on the back of a playing card in a salt mine that systematically explains how we idealize the love object in our minds.
And he inspired the Stendhal syndrome, the terrifying physical surrender, the fierce palpitation of the heart and dizziness experienced when overwhelmed by sheer, magnificent cultural accomplishment and beauty.
He was a novelist dedicated ironically to the happy few, whose prose was dismissed as paltry by Nabokov, but whose psychological vision was hailed by Nietzsche as the last great French mind.
Ultimately, he was the author who convinced critics like Auerbach that modern realism required a novelist to weave the specific, complex political and social reality of their time into the very fabric of their characters' interior lives.
It all hinges on that great Stendhalian tension between the mask and the mirror. We talk about Beylism, the term for the self-proclaimed egotism in his characters.
And Stendhal famously advised himself to look upon life as a masked ball.
This raises an important final question for you, the listener, to mull over. Stendhal was obsessed with aliases, disguise, and retreating behind a mask. Yet his greatest, most lasting value was identified by critics as his acute psychological realism.
So what is the ultimate connection between deep, often painful self-analysis, the egotism, and the fictional disguise of the novel? Is the best, most objective way to truly reflect reality through fiction to first perfect the art of the mask?
Does one need distance, emotional or perhaps physical distance, via the pseudonym to truly see and dissect the world objectively?
Something to consider the next time you find yourself wearing one identity in public while observing the world with the precision of a completely different self.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Stendhal.